Why is your grocery bill quietly connected to a trade fight with Canada that you probably never even noticed? In one sentence, because the tariff Washington imposed to punish Canadian aluminum did not punish Canada at all, it raised the price of the metal sitting inside your soda cans, your car, and your kitchen appliances. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a fight meant to protect American consumers ended up quietly taxing them instead. Let's start with the basic mechanics, because this is simpler than it sounds. Aluminum is not some obscure industrial material. It is in the can your soda comes in, the siding on your house, the body panels of your car, the foil in your kitchen drawer, the frame of your lawn chair. It touches daily life in a way that most trade disputes never do. And a little over a year ago, Washington placed a 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum, the highest rate in the history of that particular trade relationship. This tariff did not appear out of nowhere either. For years, aluminum and steel tariffs have been used as one of the sharpest tools in American trade policy, dating back to national security justifications first invoked years earlier. What changed this time was the size of the number. 50% is not a modest adjustment. It is closer to doubling the price of every ton of Canadian aluminum crossing the border. When a tariff jumps that high that quickly, businesses on both sides of the border do not have the luxury of waiting around to see how it plays out. They start making decisions immediately, and those decisions have consequences that ripple outward for years, not months. The stated goal was simple: protect American aluminum production, punish Canada for what officials called unfair trade practices, and bring manufacturing jobs home. That is the story you have probably heard, and it sounds reasonable enough on the surface. But here is where it gets complicated, and where the story most people are telling you leaves out the most important part. Aluminum is not like other goods in a trade war. You cannot simply stop buying it or find a substitute overnight. American factories that make cars, cans, and appliances need a steady supply of it every single day. And for decades, a huge share of that supply came from one place: Canada. Specifically from massive smelters in Quebec, powered by some of the cheapest and cleanest hydroelectric power on the planet. So when Washington taxed that supply at 50%, it did not just hurt the Canadian producer selling it. It hurt every American manufacturer who still needed to buy it, because the tariff gets added directly onto the price before the metal ever reaches a factory floor. Economists have a simple way of explaining this. A tariff is a tax, and it is usually not the foreign country that pays it. It is the buyer on the other end, the American company, and eventually the American customer standing in a checkout line. Now, here is the part of the story that almost nobody explains clearly, and it is the reason this whole plan started to unravel. Canada did not just sit there and absorb the 50% tax. Canadian aluminum producers looked at their options and made a simple business decision. If the American market was going to tax their product that heavily, they would sell somewhere else instead. And at almost exactly the same moment, a separate crisis on the other side of the world handed them the perfect opportunity. The conflict involving Iran disrupted oil and energy flows across the Middle East, and that region also happens to produce a meaningful share of the world's aluminum smelting capacity. Since smelting aluminum requires enormous amounts of continuous, reliable energy, and several Gulf nations built their aluminum industries specifically around access to cheap natural gas and oil to power that process. When that supply got knocked offline, Europe, which relies heavily on Middle Eastern aluminum, suddenly faced a massive shortage. Analysts estimate Europe is now short several million tons of aluminum this year alone, a far bigger gap than what the United States is dealing with. European buyers, desperate for supply, started paying record high premiums for aluminum well above the normal global benchmark price. And Canadian producers, sitting right next door to a market that suddenly could not get enough of it, saw an opening. They started shipping more and more of their aluminum across the Atlantic instead of south across the border. The numbers on this shift are not small. Canadian aluminum exports to the European Union went from almost nothing at the start of last year to as much as 40% of their total monthly exports by early this year. In one recent month alone, Canada's aluminum exports jumped by more than 50% compared to the month before, driven almost entirely by new demand from the Netherlands, Italy, and Greece. Think about what that actually means for the plan Washington had in mind. The tariff was supposed to make Canada dependent on the American market and force concessions. Instead, it pushed Canadian producers to build new customer relationships in Europe, relationships that do not disappear the moment a trade dispute cools down. Once a European manufacturer signs a new supply contract with a Canadian smelter, that contract does not just evaporate because Washington changes its tariff rate 6 months later. These are the kinds of business relationships that take years to build and years to unwind. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the aluminum that American factories still need has not gotten any cheaper. If anything, the opposite is happening. With less Canadian metal flowing south, and with global aluminum prices already climbing because of the shortage in Europe, American buyers are now competing for a smaller pool of supply at a moment when prices are already elevated. Industry analysts have pointed out that the price American buyers pay, sometimes called the Midwest Premium, needs to rise even further if the United States wants to win that Canadian metal back from European buyers who are already paying more for it. This is where the story finally connects back to your kitchen table. When the raw material going into a can of soda costs more, that cost does not just disappear into a corporate spreadsheet. It gets passed down the supply chain from the aluminum producer to the can manufacturer to the beverage company to the shelf at your local grocery store. The same is true for cars, for appliances, for the siding on a house, for the folding chairs people bring to the lake in summer. Every one of those products has a little bit of tariff baked into its price now, whether the label mentions it or not. Think through your own week for a moment and count how many aluminum-containing products actually pass through your hands. The soda or sparkling water can in the refrigerator, the foil wrapped around leftovers, the pots and pans in the kitchen cabinet, the frame of a screen door, a gutter, a storm window. If you drive, the hood and wheels of your car likely contain aluminum, since manufacturers have leaned on it for decades to keep vehicles lighter and more fuel efficient. None of these individual items will bankrupt anyone on their own, but that is exactly the point. A tariff that raises costs by even a small percentage across dozens of everyday categories adds up to real money over the course of a year, money that quietly leaves a household budget without ever showing up as a single identifiable expense you could point to and say, there, that is the tariff. And here's the part that should make you angry if you're the kind of person watching your monthly budget closely. The tariff was sold to the public as a way to protect American workers and punish a foreign competitor. Instead, the foreign competitor found new customers and it is the American consumer quietly absorbing the cost increase on everyday products month after month without ever being told why prices at the store keep creeping upward. If you are living on a fixed income, this kind of hidden cost hits differently than it does for someone still bringing in a paycheck that adjusts with inflation. A can of soup costing a few cents more does not sound like much in isolation, but stack that same small increase across every canned good, every appliance repair, every car part, every aluminum ladder or lawn chair replaced over a year, and it becomes real money, quietly subtracted from a budget that was not built with room for surprises. Pension checks and Social Security payments do not automatically rise the moment a trade policy decision in Washington raises the price of raw materials halfway around the supply chain. That gap between when a cost increase actually hits and when any income adjustment catches up is exactly where a lot of retirees feel squeezed the hardest, even when they cannot point to the exact policy responsible. This is also why so few people connect a grocery bill to a tariff schedule in the first place. Nobody sends you a notice saying your canned green beans cost 11 cents more this month because of a trade dispute over Canadian aluminum. The cost just shows up, spread so thin across so many products that it becomes almost invisible, even though the total effect on a household budget over a full year is anything but invisible. Let's talk about who actually benefits and who actually loses in this situation, because it is not who Washington promised it would be. It helps to think about this the way you would think about any household decision involving a supplier who suddenly overcharges you. If your regular hardware store doubled the price of lumber overnight, you would not just keep buying from them out of loyalty. You would call around, find another supplier, and once you found one who treated you fairly, you would probably keep buying from them even after the original store lowered its price again, just because trust and habit matter in business relationships. That is essentially what happened here, except the supplier is Canada. The overpriced store is the United States. And the new supplier found treating them fairly right now is Europe. Canadian aluminum producers are, by most measures, doing better than they were before the tariff, not worse. They found buyers willing to pay record prices, and unlike a captive American market where the price was somewhat controlled by long-standing relationships, the European market right now is paying whatever it takes to get supply during a genuine shortage. That is not the outcome anyone in Washington was hoping for when this tariff was signed. American aluminum producers, the ones this tariff was supposed to help, are seeing some benefit since domestic metal is now more competitive against a 50% tax on the Canadian alternative. But American aluminum production capacity is limited, and it cannot simply expand overnight to fill the entire gap left behind. Building a new smelter takes years and enormous amounts of capital and electricity. And aluminum smelting, in particular, requires a level of cheap, reliable power that not every region of the United States can easily provide. So even with the tariff in place, the United States still needs to import a significant amount of aluminum from somewhere, and every ton of that import now costs more than it used to. And American consumers, the people this policy was supposedly protecting, are the ones absorbing the difference, spread out in small increments across thousands of everyday products, in a way that is almost impossible to trace back to a single cause unless someone actually explains it to you like we are doing right now. It is worth pausing here to notice something else too. The companies actually buying aluminum in bulk, the beverage makers, the automakers, the appliance manufacturers, are not simply absorbing this cost increase out of their own profit margins. forever. These are large, sophisticated corporations with pricing teams whose entire job is making sure input costs get passed along to the end customer without shrinking the bottom line. That is not a conspiracy. It is just how large manufacturing businesses operate, and it means the gap between what a company pays for aluminum and what you pay at checkout tends to close itself, usually within a matter of months, not years. Let's talk about where this goes from here because there are three realistic paths, and each one affects your wallet differently. The first scenario: the tariff gets quietly reduced or exempted for certain aluminum products, especially once the political pressure from rising consumer prices becomes impossible to ignore. This has already happened with other tariffs in this trade war, where the loud initial number gets walked back through carve-outs and exceptions once the economic reality sets in. If this happens, expect it to happen without much fanfare, a policy adjustment buried in a press release rather than a headline announcement. Watch for exemptions specifically on aluminum used in food and beverage packaging first, since that is the category most directly tied to grocery prices that voters notice every single week, and the category most likely to generate angry phone calls to elected officials. The second scenario: the tariff stays exactly where it is, and Canadian producers continue deepening their relationship with European buyers, permanently redirecting a meaningful share of their aluminum production away from the American market. In this scenario, American consumers should expect the elevated prices on aluminum containing products to become the new normal, not a temporary spike. Once supply chains reorganize around a new set of trading partners, they tend to stay that way even after the original dispute that caused the shift is long forgotten. For a retiree budgeting month to month, this is the scenario that matters most, because it means the higher price on canned goods and appliances is not a blip that resolves itself. It becomes the baseline you are planning around from now on. The third scenario, and the one that could actually work out well for American consumers eventually: the shortage in Europe resolves itself once the Iran-related disruption calms down and Middle Eastern aluminum supply comes back online. If that happens, European premiums could fall back toward normal levels, making the American market relatively more attractive again for Canadian producers and potentially easing some of the price pressure here at home. This scenario depends entirely on geopolitical events outside anyone's direct control, which makes it the hardest one to predict with any real confidence. And even in this best-case outcome, prices rarely fall back down as quickly as they rose, since manufacturers who raise their prices to cover higher input costs are in no hurry to lower them again the moment costs ease, even a little. There is one more angle worth mentioning before we move to what this all means going forward. Some of the same Canadian producers now selling into Europe have said publicly that once you account for what gets paid to the American government in tariffs, the European option simply nets out better for them financially, even before factoring in the shortage-driven premium. That is a business making a rational decision based on the numbers in front of it, not a political statement. But it means the 50% tariff itself is functioning almost like a permanent thumb on the scale, quietly steering Canadian aluminum toward Europe regardless of what happens with the Middle East situation, which suggests this shift may be stickier than a lot of people currently assume. Whichever path plays out, there is a broader lesson here that applies well beyond aluminum, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Tariffs work best as leverage when the country being taxed has no other options. The moment that country finds an alternative buyer, the tariff stops being leverage and starts being a tax that the tariffing country's own citizens end up paying instead. We saw this exact pattern play out with Canadian oil heading to Asian markets, and now we are watching it happen again with aluminum heading to Europe. This is becoming a repeating pattern in this trade war, not an isolated exception. Here's my honest read on where this settles. I think the political pressure from rising consumer prices eventually forces some kind of quiet adjustment, probably before the next election cycle heats up, because no administration wants to be blamed for the price of everyday household goods creeping upward for reasons voters do not understand. But I also think the underlying shift in where Canadian aluminum goes is more permanent than people realize. Once European buyers and Canadian producers build these new relationships during a genuine shortage, some of that trade does not simply snap back to the way things were before, even if the tariff itself eventually changes. There is a pattern forming here that goes beyond just one metal or one trade dispute. Every time this administration has reached for a tariff as a tool of pressure, the country on the receiving end has had one advantage the tariff cannot easily counter, which is time and the willingness to look elsewhere. Oil went to Asia. Aluminum is going to Europe. Each time the reaction has been the same, and each time American consumers have ended up holding a piece of the bill that nobody explained to them in advance. The bigger takeaway for you, watching this from home and wondering why prices on ordinary things keep climbing, is this. Not every price increase makes headlines. Not every policy decision gets explained honestly to the people who end up paying for it. And a trade fight that sounds like it is happening far away between two governments in language full of percentages and tariff schedules often ends up mattering most in the most ordinary places, like the checkout line at your local grocery store. So here is the question I want you to sit with. If a tariff meant to protect American consumers ends up costing them money instead, who should actually be held accountable for that? The country that found a better buyer or the policy that assumed it never would? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me if you have noticed prices creeping up on anything specific lately, whether it is canned goods, a car, or something else entirely. If breaking down how these trade decisions actually reach your wallet is useful to you, hit subscribe, because we are going to keep tracking exactly where these policies end up landing, not just what gets announced in a press conference. And if you want to see how this same pattern played out with Canadian oil heading to Asia instead of the United States, go back and watch that video, because the two stories are more connected than they first appear. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.